development. The topic of internal migration is very important. It is presented in the public discourse, in research. So today we will discuss with you everything that we know about internal migration, trends and problems in the country, which might arise because of that. We will also discuss the conditions of life and work of internal migrants. And of course, we will discuss some of the challenges that internal migration poses within the context of regional development and inequality in Ukraine. So today we will discuss that with analyst and researcher at Cedos, Alexander Slobodyan, with urban geographer and housing policy analyst Pavlo Fedoryv, and Oleg Borisov, deputy chairman, Building Workers Union of Ukraine, and expert on employment and internal migration. I would like to tell you about the structure of our event today. So at the very beginning, we will listen to presentation by our speakers. They will reflect some of the key issues which are related to internal migration. And then we will proceed to discussion. So before I give it over to our first speaker, Alexandra, I would like to give the floor to representative of our partners in our project, University Viadrina, Frankfurt, Mr. Stefan. So Stefan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tasha, and great thanks to the whole team of Cedos actually for putting this event together. It's a pleasure actually to have this as a collaboration from the side also of the European University Viadrina, as Tasha said, in the framework of the program Ukraine Calling, which is a capacity building organized by a university with its partners, and it's a capacity building for civil society organizations. And for the last 2 years, we've worked together with 25 organizations from Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, France, and Germany in order to develop their project ideas for transnational and cross-sectoral projects. And the topics of the last 2 years were migration and local development. And that's why it's great to have as a kind of final discussion brought these two topics together. And I'm really looking forward to the exchange and wish everybody a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So I would like to ask Olena Serbu whether she wants to tell us a couple of words at the very beginning of our event.
I was actually going to say something similar that Stefan said, that actually we had this year the series of public events which were dedicated to the topic of local development. And we had a few discussions, master classes, and networking event, and they all were connected to the local development and regional policies, decentralization, and urban development. So today, it would be also great to have this discussion as a closing one, because it really connects 2 years of Ukraine Calling projects, of which Cedos is very proud to be a partner. So I also wish you a very nice discussion, and Tasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Olena. Okay, so we start our discussion, and I would like to give it over to Alexander Slobodyan, our analyst. Alexander will tell us more what we know about internal migration in Ukraine. What is the current situation? And let me tell you that if you have any questions, you are welcome to write them in the chat, or if you are watching live on Facebook. You can also leave your questions in the comment section, and Alexandra will be able to answer this question after her presentation. So, Alexandra, over to you. Good afternoon. Using this opportunity to be the first speaker today, I would like to, first of all, to tell you some of the theoretical conditions. So who are we talking about? When we speak of internal migration, we are speaking of two types of migrants. So these are those migrants that commute, they are commuters, they work and live in different places. So, for example, they might go commute every day to work to another city or another town every day or several times per week. Speaking of migrants, we often mean a little bit different type of migrants. These are migrants who are actually internally displaced people, meaning people or just people who relocated from one city to another or from one location to another. So this second definition of an internal migrant, this is mostly a definition which is used by different international organizations to assess the scope of migration. So by migrant, we mean a person who has relocated, who has changed the place of their living. There are different criteria as for the time the person has lived in another town or city. There is no consensus as for that. Sometimes people say that a person must live for more than 6 months, then we can tell her, him, a migrant. However, nobody can prove that. As for this group of internal migrants who relocated, we also mean migrants who have whose place of residence has changed. As for the both groups of migrants, we have data over the State Statistical Service. This is very important to have this state statistical data, especially when we are talking about the cities, because we understand that different cities have different level of development, their institutional capacity is also different. That is why it is very important that all the cities and towns, despite their institutional capacity, have access to data. So state statistics provides also this access to data. Speaking of those who commute every day from their home to work, so-called commuters, then the State Statistical Service provides us a little bit of data. From time to time, they access the workforce, and there are questions in this opinion poll whether a person has worked in another town or city, different from the place they live in. In Ukraine, we have 13% of commuters, of people who live in one city and work in another city. 11% they commute in their region, their oblast, or in their district. Oh, the State Statistical Service means region. So there are commuters who travel around their oblast, and most of these migrants live in Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernivtsi, or Lviv Oblast, so in the west of Ukraine. Speaking of longer distances, the State Statistical Service, they use the concept of moving from one administrative center to another administrative center. As for the as for such migrants who move to another region or abroad, there are 2.14%. In most cases, those commuters, they travel from so they live and work in Kyiv or Zhytomyr Oblast, and also from Kyiv, because Kyiv, the capital, and the oblast of Kyiv, they are different from administrative point of view. There is a differentiation. The State Statistical Service collects this data, but unfortunately don't always publish these massive data. That is why we can see general numbers, and we can take a look at this data in different regions. However, we cannot do an in-depth analysis. World Bank has carried out uh, a more in-depth analysis more than 10 years ago. This analysis has shown then the population who lives in the rural territories are more prone to this migration because they move to the cities, and 3/4 of all the commute happens in Kiev, to and from Kiev. As for this labor migration, high qualification workers are part of this commute. So probably this is some kind of a compensation, meeting the demand for manual labor in the capital of Ukraine and in Kyiv Oblast. So I hope that as for these internal labor migrants, I hope that Oleg will tell you more about that. However, now I would like to tell you about the second category of internal migrants. So these are the internal migrants who move from one place to another. The State Statistical Service also collects data according to international standards. So the State Statistics Service collects administrative data about the change of the place of registration. And based on this information, they use information on the legal address of a person. So the place where the person is legally registered. Taking a look at the statistics, which is published by the State Statistics Service, approximately 500,000, from 500 to 800,000 people every year migrate within the country. However, this is a very small percentage, about 1% from all the population of Ukraine. As for this data, there is uh, there is a problem related to this data because not all citizens of Ukraine live at the place where they are legally registered. It is very obvious, even from the official data. If we take a look at the distribution of these internal migrants, according to the State Statistical Service, we would see that the majority of those internal migrants, these are young people. Because, for example, young people, they move to a bigger city or to another city to study at a local university. They often get registered at student residence, and that is why we see that most of internal migrants are young people. So we could make the decision, the conclusion that most of them are young people, and partly that is true because because according to our estimations, in 2019, 2020, 56% of people who entered a university, they chose another location, another town or city where they lived. So almost half of all the students, when they study, they change their place of residence. And that is why students are part of these official statistics. However, this official statistics excludes one large group of people. So these are people who don't often have a registration, legal registration of their place of residence. According to our research, we have evaluated how many people live in another place than their place of registered, and in Ukraine, about 12%, 3.3 million people don't live at their official registered legal place of residence. The majority of those people are registered in another oblast, in another region of Ukraine. And those people mostly live in Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. So those are people who live in Kyiv. They are registered outside of the Kyiv or Kyiv Oblast. We have also seen that part of those people who don't live at the place of their official residence are from 25, 23 to 34 years of age. So those are young people who graduate from a university. They still don't have their own flat or house, so they don't have a legal registration. They rent a flat, for example. This ownership of real estate is some kind of precondition for registration, because 3% of the population who lives in their own flats, they live at the place that they are not registered in. There are a number of people who live at their relatives or who rent a flat. They're also not registered there, and that's a problem because we underestimate the number of people who live in the cities, and consequently, the cities cannot make informed decisions. Decisions which are related to infrastructure, to building new schools and kindergartens. So probably this is the most painful issue for those who live in Kiev but are not registered there. But it's also very important for the unofficial residents of the city, because it is more difficult to them to get access to some services. Sometimes they have to uh, move to other cities just to get a service. And it impacts their relationship between those people and their native city. According to our research, those people who are not registered, they don't often take part in different events which are related to the neighborhood where they live in. They don't contribute much to different issues which happen locally, and of course, they vote rarely at local elections. So this is a group of people which is potentially very active. However, they do not take an active part in the life of the city they live in because of some of these structural challenges. Will census help solve this problem? Will we get more data about the residents if we carry out a census? So the answer is yes or not, because we will get a snapshot of what is happening in the city now. However, the problem with the registration of the place of residence hasn't been tackled yet. Even despite the recent changes to the legislation, precondition for registration in many cases is agreement from the owner of the flat.
So if the person cannot get the consent of the flat or house landlord, a person cannot inform the address of residence. So after certain time after the census, we will face this problem again, that we don't have reliable data on internal migration and reliable data on the population of the cities where migrants live. So the mechanisms mechanism should be changed. A new mechanism should be developed under which people will have opportunity to register their place of residence. Also, we need to encourage people to register their place of residence because we see there are lots of stereotypes that are a barrier for this. In some cases, people just don't feel any need to inform the state about the actual place of residence. And sometimes people tend not to inform when they want to take advantage, for example, of subsidies or other advantages. So it's time to finish my presentation. I would like to underline once again that having the data from State Statistics Service about the population of the cities is highly important, and it is responsibility of the State Statistics Service, other authorities, and the population of these cities to inform about the actual situation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandra. We have a question about State Statistics Service and how they work, about the employment. So it's a question from Facebook stream. So the question is whether State Statistics Service collects any data about the employment of individual entrepreneurs. For example, individual entrepreneurs who work as outsourcers, or whether the State Statistics Service collects the data only from the state enterprises. If we're talking about commuters, so we do polls. We do labor force survey, we do a big poll of the certain part of the population, irrespective of whether they work on the state enterprises, whether they're individual entrepreneurs, or they're employed in any other types of organizations or companies. So people are asked whether they work in the other city, town, village, different from where they permanently live. It's not an administrative data, it's the data from the poll. One more question. What is your opinion about alternative channels of collecting the data, for example, the data of mobile operators? In my speech, I said that I think in all the cities we should have the data accessible about the migration, mobility, and when we are speaking about some private things like partnership with business, etc., here there are a lot of questions. Not all the cities can cooperate with mobile operators because very often it implies some additional funding, additional resources. Also, there is a big question about the ethical side of such collection of data. This is a personal information, so the data should be open. The data collected should be open data. Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. There are no more questions, but if you happen to have any other questions to Alexandra, you will be able to set them later during the common discussion. Now I would like to give floor to Pavlo Fedoriev, who will speak on the internal migration and challenges within the context of regional policy and city development. Pavlo, the floor is yours. Uh, Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. So I'm going to speak about three major things. First, about the roots of the current situation of regional development and migration. Then we will talk about what is actually happening today. And third question, what are the future challenges for the population and the country in general? So I will start by saying that Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, inherited all the existing systems like resettlement systems, the inequalities that existed in the beginning of 1990s. In the Soviet Union, the city development was something to achieve, was a tool to achieve social equality, social justice. So the development of the society was connected with industrialization and which means urbanization. And to manage the resettlement system and to accelerate the urbanization process, there were different mechanisms of how to implement this. The development of towns and small cities were encouraged. On the other hand, when the villages changed their status into the towns and cities, it was also encouraged to level up their administrative level and level of the services that could be provided in this locality. The official regional policy was based on overcoming the gap between the village and the city. That's why the part of the villages automatically turned into towns, but not necessarily without not necessarily starting to live like city citizens. So Ukraine inherited this system of population resettlement and this village town city system. So in the beginning of 1990s, Ukraine was very unbalanced, and we had all these gaps between villages and cities and inequalities that became even more sharp. And we had these differences between villages and towns, between towns and big cities, etc. In order to be able to manage all this, some relevant state regional policy was necessary. However, still Soviet approach could still be traced, and if 1990s were the period of general decline and there were only several regions which were growing like industrial regions, then in 2000s the microeconomical growth started. But let us talk about the consequences in the regional dimension. The previous regional development strategy tells us that this microeconomical growth didn't influence positively on overcoming the gap in inequality between the regions. Moreover, the economical potential continued to concentrate in big cities, several economic centers. In 2010, there was a wonderful article, Ukrainian space economy, and one of the authors of this article is Adam Swain, where they say that during the 20 years of independence, there was a dramatic change in the way how Ukraine organizes its economy and territorial policy. Then in 90s, we continued the industrialization model, and the industrial regions were supported more, and the most of economical potential was concentrated there. So in 2000s, it was the shift to the services. And here we talk about Kyiv and some other big cities like Dnipro, Kharkiv, or Lviv as a center of tourism in Ukraine. And in 2012, there was a competition for hosting Euro Championship, and the city started to invest in their infrastructure like stadiums, roads, etc. And developing their service infrastructure like hotel chains, restaurants, etc. Michnenko and Swain, the authors of another article of 2007, where they analyzed the Eastern European cities, they say that half of the cities in Ukraine were at the line of the decline, which means that the number of population grew, and then in the 1990s and in 2000 there was a decline in population, and only part of these cities managed to start growing again after the fall in 1990s. What is happening today? And here we have to think, like, why do we think we have to manage this at all? Regional policy could be aimed at different targets, but mostly it's aimed to guarantee people the relevant quality of life in the country. Ukrainian constitution guarantees the allocation of common wealth between people and between communities. And speaking of 2014, at that moment, Ukraine was rather unbalanced country, and in terms of the regional development, and we needed some kind of reform, and it was an umbrella decentralization reform that came up. And this umbrella reform included a lot of different reforms. The territorial communities started to amalgamate, to unite, and the system of authorities, of power started to change. In Ukraine, the decentralization reform is ongoing, and it will be happening for a long time. And it is a constant search of the best configuration of the localities of territorial communities and the scope of authorities that could be given to people to guarantee the relevant life quality. Decentralization, the aim of the decentralization was to balance the sectoral policies and territorial policies, bring them into relevance and compliance, but this is not what this didn't happen. Still, these policies are not very well connected, because some reforms tie up people to their place of residence and other on the contrary. For example, medical reform allows you to make a contract with your family doctor irrespective of your place of residence. And the educational reform says that children should go to school at the place where they're registered or their parents are registered. And this makes it complicated for the people to receive their services. So state regional policy tries to make the chances equal for all the people to get the adequate services through the system of subventions. This could be subventions from the central budget, for example, educational, medical, infrastructural subventions, social and economical subventions for the development of the territories. And on the other hand, we can speak about the horizontal balancing when we do the balancing between the communities. What is it about the communities that have enough resources can share part of their funds with the other communities that don't have enough? How is it connected with migration actually? During the last decade in Ukraine, we observed the dramatic decline of population. And it happens in cities and in villages, and part of the regions lost their population dramatically, and researchers start to study this phenomenon. So the World Bank report for 2015 on urbanization processes tells us that more than 80% of population lives in cities, and still here we observe decline. And all the regional policy now tells us that we don't have any relevant data about which number of people live where, and the cities and towns, they take decision without having the relevant data. So 1/3 of the cities, according to World Bank report, despite their losing their population in their development plans, uh, they expect the growth of population at a certain moment. Why is it a problem? Because it doesn't. They seem not to take into account this phenomenon of cities reduction, which is very well studied, and Western European cities faced this in 70s and 80s, and the Eastern European cities starting from the 90s. What is this, the reduction, and what is actually being reduced? We cannot give a certain explanation. We can say that is the reduction of population generally, the reduction of population which is economically active. And what is the problem? In the ideal model, it looks like this. If city loses its population, it loses its economical activity, less taxes, which means people can receive less services or services of lower quality in this territory, and this results in migration and another wave of population decline. There can be several reasons of this process. The first is the decline and aging of the population. Less children are being born. There are other reasons like migration. It can be external migration and internal migration. And internal migration, speaking of internal migration, we can speak about urbanization and suburbanization, which results in the reduction of taxes in the city, the reduction of taxpayers in the city. So what can be done according to the World Bank? Considering the decline of the population of the cities, Ukraine must implement the state policies to manage the population in the cities. If we open the new draft of the strategy up to 2027, we will not see any propositions on how we can control the population or how the migration processes develop, influence the development. And the word migration itself is mentioned only 7 times maybe, and it is more about external migration. We are saying that Ukraine is losing its labor force because people are immigrating. And a lot of reasons for migration do not have enough attention. If the phenomenon is not well studied enough, we can do nothing about it. We cannot propose a solution. And this migration in the future will result in 2 big challenges. On one hand, we will have to manage the cities which are now reducing and declining. So usually, speaking of migration, we speak about young people, active people, but if they move out, they don't pay taxes, and when they move out, only the groups of vulnerable groups of people and groups of people with low mobility stay, and there is a need in services. On the other hand, we have big regional centers and capital, and they will experience the inflow of migrants from other regions, and they will have to plan better their services. Also, they have to plan the effective usage of resources to provide the infrastructure to make sure that all the cities can provide the adequate level to the services and would enjoy their rights guaranteed.
As for the third challenge, it is related to migration and potential migration of people from the rural areas. It might open with so-called opening of the rural land market in Ukraine. Let me remind you that rural population in Ukraine is decreasing much faster than population of the cities. It decreases so fast that we can say that urbanization is still going on in Ukraine. This opening of the rural land market might lead in the future that more and more people from the rural areas will sell their land plots if they don't have adequate opportunity to live in the rural area, and they will move to the cities. On one hand, it will lead to depopulation of the rural areas, to decrease of the level of quality of life in the villages. On the other hand, there will be more load on the urban areas under conditions where the cities are not ready to accept new people. I mean, using social infrastructure, the real estate market also won't be big enough to make sure that everyone has a place to live. So in Ukraine, it's quite difficult to understand the market of the rental flats. It's quite complicated, and there's no normal mortgage systems. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you so much, Pavlo. So I don't see any questions yet. And so if there are no questions, let's proceed to third presentation by Oleg Borisov. Oleg will tell us about key challenges of people who work in the construction. This is one of the areas where most internal migrants live who move to bigger cities to find work. So just a second, I will share a presentation by Oleg, and Oleg, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is a very professional event. As far as I see, the question of internal migration is not discussed enough. Most people are interested in labor migration. However, internal migration, as we see, is a part of labor migration in Ukraine. So thank you so much for putting my presentation on the screen. So I see there's some kind of an issue. Just a second. So as for the internal migration, my topic is dedicated to internal migration and the working conditions of builders. As Alexandra has said, the issue of internal migration, especially migration of construction workers, so this is a question of commuting. Next slide, please. I will share a little bit of statistical data with you. So unfortunately, the population of Ukraine is decreasing, but more than 500,000 of persons move from one place to another. So most of them are women. Urban population makes almost 70%. As Pablo has said, there is the population of the rural areas because young people move away, and not only because of that. Next slide, please. The key regions of internal migrants, this is Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, as well as such regions as you can see on this slide, the Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Lviv. These are the key cities and oblasts which are interesting to internal migrants, especially to those migrants who are commuters. Migration to big cities, this is the opportunity to get a higher wage, to get a job, and just to survive, to get some kind of salary, especially to rural population. Mostly internal migrants work in construction, in trade, catering, transport, and they also work as domestic staff. More than 2 million people work in different location than the one where they live. This is an interesting statistics. Comparing to international statistics, we know that from several million people work abroad, and in Ukraine, this is similar. On the next slide, you can see information about internal migration, working conditions of construction workers in Ukraine. Unfortunately, construction industry lacks workers. Within the past year, the industry has lost almost 140,000 people. As for the informal employment, it makes 17.2%. So as for the young people who work to live to work in the big cities, however, the average age of builders is from 40 to 50 years. It is interesting that in many locations, there's almost no male population of this age in some locations. So we are speaking of commuting because there are construction workers who work and live in the places where they live. They even live on or near the construction place where they work. As we can see, total working time is 10 hours, 6 days a week. So as far as I understand, most of these people don't always have the opportunity to go home after such a long day of work. So they just fall asleep right there or in a residence building provided by their employers. So after this 6 days a week, working week, they might come home to get a rest. Lunch break is maximum 30 minutes and just awful. So these people just eat where they work. What is also very negative is the provision of personal protective equipment. I would like to say that it is related to all construction workers, to internal migrants and to other. There is a huge lack, insufficiency of protective equipment. They need to buy working gloves or helmets, and they can receive that from their employers only when there is some kind of inspection or visits to the construction site. Next slide, please. And now let's discuss payments in this area. Now we can see that in September 2021, the average salary was 9,800, and last year 900, 300. So the difference is only about 5%. In March, we have started working saying that this salary is too low. And of course, this is the most important thing that we try to improve. As for the hourly wage, it is 36.11 hryvnias. In comparison to the last year, it increased only by 6 hryvnias. As for the analysis of commuting, those construction workers in Ukraine, they usually read these announcements, job offers, and most often there is only official salary mentioned there. Most of them get some kind of unofficial salaries in an envelope, But however, most construction workers, they do not receive that. It's interesting that the wage areas in the construction industry is increasing. So now we have 87.5 million hryvnias as outstanding payments to construction workers. As for the holidays and social protection and sick leaves, construction workers do not receive full social benefits for their work. Next slide, please. Very often, the foreman just offer them to take a leave for 1 week just to have a rest. By the way, our internal migrants, they are not interested in these social benefits. They just want to get a job, to have the opportunity to get some money. Especially, it is a serious question from the rural population. And of course, you understand that. As for the current relationship between the employers and construction workers, there is some kind of a deformation. The employer sets the rules, even this they're very hard. For example, they say that construction workers as internal migrants have the right to come home at night. But as we see, the situation is that they just live on the construction site. So this is the community in which this is the internal migration in our sphere. As for the occupational safety and working hygiene, unfortunately, almost 15% of the total number of fatal injuries at work occur in the construction industry, and the number of victims and injured increases every year. There are many more accidents than official statistics show. We, as the trade union, we have our own statistics. We can say that these construction workers who work at different construction sites, they sometimes ignore safety. They just want to earn money. And slide number 8 is related to what we do, how we protect the rights of the construction workers as the trade union. So first, what is important is legal assistance to these people, because they just fill in different documents, and very often employers just ignore the questions of official documents. Our internal migrants often work at different enterprises. That is why we need to provide to them legal assistance. Another important issue is interaction with state supervision bodies. We just need to make sure that everything is safe and secure. Another important issue is the institutions of vocational education, because everyone says that it is very important to support our young people, especially those people who move from the rural areas to the big cities and there and stay there. And what is also important to us is interaction with the media. There are classic and non-classic ways of protecting. There was a strike recently of construction workers, and they protested and they wanted their salary increased. It happened in Kyiv. However, these construction workers, they didn't live in Kyiv. They just came here to make some money. And this is the reflection of the situation which happens with internal migrants all over Ukraine. By the way, you need to pay attention to this, because they say, so how people can solve this issue of labor migration, of this internal migration, when they see that the labor market, when they see the situation on the labor market in Ukraine, they are not afraid of anything. That is why they are not afraid to move abroad to find some work. Thank you. You can close my presentation. But what I would like to add, I would like to say that the topic of your project is very interesting. First, it is very interesting to assess, to evaluate the conditions of the labor market in Ukraine, because we see that there is some deformation of this labor market. Unfortunately, we cannot tackle the issue right away. So that's just great that you analysts and professionals discuss all this issue. I think it is necessary that the relevant authorities pay more attention to this, because do you know how is that? People just go to work, they stay there. However, these people get exhausted physically, morally, psychologically, and that is very serious. It's relevant not only to the construction area, but also to other areas. Because these people, they often just sleep on the transport, they eat on the go. And there are some awful things happening to these people who are physically exhausted. And we need to do something to the labor market. So I didn't discuss the issue of internal of IDPs, because IDPs have even more serious problems. So the only thing we can do as experts, as Pablo has said, we can pay more attention to the fact that we need to do something with the rural population, because Ukrainian villages are dying. Recently, I visited Chernihiv region, and you just go through the village, and there's no one there. Probably there are some old people living there, and this is an example only in one oblast. But I think that the situation in other oblasts is similar. So we need to do something to that. I'm really grateful for your invitation. Your questions are very important, and your project is very important. So thank you so much. I will be happy to take your questions. Oleg, thank you so much. As of now, we don't have any concrete questions. So dear participants, please do ask your question, or probably you can share your thoughts related to the topic of our discussion. You can do that in the chat, you can do it in the comment section on Facebook. And now we are proceeding to the discussion part of our event today. So you can just raise your hand and ask your question or make a comment. Please do use this opportunity, and I will use my opportunity as a moderator. And I would like to ask you a question, my first question, or not really, because, sorry, just a second. So, okay, I will ask this question. My question is the following. Pavlo, in his speech, raised the issue related to decentralization, administrative reform. So I would like to ask him, first, I would ask Pablo to start. Probably other speakers will add something to that. Can we expect a decrease in the scale of internal migration, or probably changes of the trends of internal migration thanks to the new policies of local development? Will decentralization influence the situation, or probably decentralization will lead to better collection of data, to a more realistic assessment of the situation? Because it would seem that decentralized management requires this data. So will decentralization provide more tools? So first question, will decentralization influence on the process of internal migration? And second, will it contribute to better collection of data? So Pablo, you can start, please. Okay, I will start with data collection. Next year, more than 130 territorial communities in Ukraine will receive expert assistance from the Ministry of Regional Development and Territories of Ukraine in order to develop their individual development strategies. To do that, they will need adequate data. What's the problem? The problem is that this regional policy shall help not only each community to develop their individual strategy of development, but it would also help them understand how these individual strategies fit into cooperation with other communities and with the country as a whole.
Було мати розуміння, що відбувається в інших громадах, ну і в країні загалом. Ну, для якраз і потрібен також перед.
Communities and with this census, we need census for this purpose. Also, we need to understand how decentralization will influence migration. And it is too early to say, I believe. As I mentioned in my speech earlier, decentralization is an ongoing process and it will continue. And we're going to have this process of search of new borders for territorial units, for localities that would be able to guarantee to people relevant services and rights to education, rights to relevant medical service, etc. What will stimulate migration? I think that's the scaleful construction projects. So the construction creates a lot of points of links between different cities, different communities, villages, and cities. It opens more opportunities for people, for businesses to receive access to jobs or to labor force. Also, this will stimulate migration and maybe not labor migration, but migration of students or school children who would be able to go to other localities because according to the educational system now there will be hub schools and children from small villages will commute to some bigger village where this hub school is, for example. Thank you very much, Pavlo. Alexandra, maybe you could add something on this. Regarding decentralization reform, I witnessed a very interesting discussion lately, and I would like to tell you about it. We see that decentralization process brings to the cities the idea that they need some reliable data on the population. And sometimes this motivation is very rational because the number of people registered uh, uh, influence the amount of the budgets allocated because it is based on the number of people registered at a certain locality. And there was an interesting discussion that cities and towns need reliable information on the population in the context of the taxes, because this task is this tax is the considerable part of the local budget, and there was a discussion how we should allocate this tax, whether it should be paid in the locality where the enterprise, where a person works, should be allocated, or whether it should be allocated at the place where a person lives. So it is connected with the fact that a person can uh, live in one place, work in the other place, and receive the services in some other place. And local budgets have no tools to combine this all effectively. And this needs a very thoroughful discussion because there are territorial communities which create the possibilities for employment, and they are very interested to um, get the taxes back. So, of course, part of the taxes should go to those communities where people work. On the other hand, we have to understand that part of the services people receive at their registration place, at the place of their actual residence. Here we are talking about medical services, kindergartens, schools. So this also the services are given not only to the person who works, but to the members of his or her family, etc. And now we see that generally there is a need to have the information on the actual numbers on population. And it's the inquiry that comes from the bottom. Thank you very much, Alexander. Oleg, maybe you would like to add something? Yes, it is a very good question about the amalgamated territorial communities. Recently, we had the meeting with the representatives of territorial communities from all over the Ukraine, and they said that they were interested to increase the potential of amalgamated territorial communities to make the population grow. And there are a lot of projects like construction projects, creating of infrastructure. And so these are the things that can keep people stay in their communities. But this process is just about to start. And of course, it is in the first instance all about money because we have human resources, but we wish that money were allocated reasonably, and we wish that there were an understanding then that by allocating money we can keep people in these communities, and this is the biggest value we have to talk about. Thank you very much. Pavlo, I see Pavlo would like to add something, and then we will get back to the questions regarding the taxes. This is something I forgot to say when I was talking about the cities. When we have the tax, we have the biggest part of the taxes the state collects is the tax imposed on the people who work, and the more people migrate, the more people move out of the certain community, the less taxes this city or village receives, and the communities, the localities, they are not able thus to provide relevant services. And I think there should be some tax reform. There was a last memorandum signed between the communities and the state, the part of the tax that will stay in communities. It was increased by 6%. And now some communities will accumulate more monies, the communities to which people commute and or migrate, and the communities from which people commute or migrate, they will end up having less taxes and having less possibilities to provide relevant services. And the only thing that could help us now, and is helping now, it's and the only thing that is helping, and how odd that may sound, this bizarre system of registration, because many people are still registered in their small villages and towns, and they pay taxes there. Under other conditions, we would have a very paradoxical situation. For example, when people will be using schools and other infrastructure in a small town, and then they will move to the bigger city. There they will work and pay their taxes, and there will be no tax inflow in the smaller cities from which the people migrate, and people who stay in these cities, they will receive less. So it is good that in such a way people still have some chances either to get an education and move, or to stay in this small village or city. Thank you very much, Pavlo. We have a question from our participant, Mykola. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question about the data collection in the context of digitalization. Do we need the change of approach? I am working with communities. We are working on strategies, and we start with data collection. For example, we're collecting statistics on age and gender, and sometimes it is very difficult to collect the data because sometimes the district statistics services do not hand over the data to the communities. So communities now at level 0, and from the scratch they have to collect some data, and they do it manually, so to say. They call, they write emails, they are trying to collect some data, and the statistics, if we're talking about state statistics services, not the most reliable source of information, unfortunately. And also the question was my question about mobile operators and collecting the data from other commercial agents. On one hand, we know that these commercial agents sell data and they have data sets ready. On the other hand, there is certain mutual dependence because mobile operators and other commercial agents, they need to install their equipment somewhere, they need to have plots of lands allocated, and maybe we could propose some change to the legislation about the status of data. And the question is whether the communities can set up some conditions. For example, if they give the plot of land, they are interested to have 4G connection in their area. On the other hand, they might be interested in cooperation and to have the access to the data on the non-commercial basis, but on the other basis, because mobile operators is one of the most reliable source of the data. And maybe we can employ some more modern ways of data collection in the real time, like for example, with mobile operators, with big commercial centers and network shops. So maybe we could come up with some propositions that can result in the change of the legislation and cooperation of commercial actors with the local authorities and the bodies of local self-governance. Thank you very much, Mikola. If any of the speakers would like to react to this, to give some feedback on this, please let me know. If not, then I would have to give the floor to Alexei Moskalenko. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like just to add to the points that Mikola mentioned. 10 years ago, I used to live in Shanghai, and there is a very difficult system of registration, and 22 million of people registered. And when they were calculating the transport needs or food needs, they were calculating for 35 million people, because during the weekdays they're worker migrants, during the weekends they're tourists, and they were collecting data from mobile operators and shops, etc., to plan the services. And I think it's a relevant practice because it's the only thing for now that can give the relevant data. As to the taxes, I really like the idea of Pavlo. It will be very interesting, I think. There are some territorial communities, for example, in Cherkasy Oblast. For example, you create your individual enterprise in your oblast, and then you may decide how you want to allocate your taxes. So it's up to you to decide, and it's very interesting. It's very motivating for people because they see what can be done, what is done with their taxes. And So there is another interesting topic as the tax and other money transfers of the people who migrate. As to the mobile operators, when we're talking to young children in villages and we ask them, would you like to move out? Most of the young people raise their hands. And now they have internet, they have Instagram, and they want to be on Instagram. And living in a small village, they don't have enough settings, enough events to generate cool content to become an influencer. They don't see possibilities how they can do it if there is one street and the school and that's all. And that's why they want to move out. This new generation, they're very mobile. They will be moving and relocating all the time. And they're ready for all the opportunities, and we have to take this into account in our development strategies. Thank you very much. I know that Alexandra Slobodyan was dealing with the money transfers from external migrants, people working abroad, and I think she could add something. Yes, let me react to Mykola's statements regarding the fact that territorial communities has no information on the population and their age and gender. However, territorial communities collect some registers. So theoretically, from their registers, they should have been able to make the statistics on age and the gender structure, but it will be the statistics on the people who are registered in these territorial communities. Those this is the same information that State Statistics Service has. So it's territorial communities that give information to State Statistics Service, not vice versa. As to the mobile operators and other sources of information, which becomes accessible to us with the digitalization age, it's very interesting. We can do some research on this, but I would say it's an additional source of information. And we had an experience of a census survey based on the mobile operator data, and we received reliable data about the population, like about the number of people in certain regions, but however, we are not able to get the data on age and gender structure. So we extrapolated this data from State Statistics Service information. So I'm not sure that mobile operators can give us access to more detailed information about the population. Yes, it can be an alternative source of information. And in certain cases, the mobile operators showed really very good statistics, and it shows that official number of people living in the cities is far from reality. And we can think about some other sources of information like this, but let me underline once again, it should be an additional source of information. As to the transfers of money transfers and taxes, with the example that Alexei gave us, I have another question. You mentioned that individual entrepreneur can decide on how he or she wants to allocate their taxes. So what kind of tax allocation will be given to the city or village, or to the city or town where this individual entrepreneur works?
So thank you for raising this interesting question, this interesting issue. As for the context of these transfers of money, as far as I understand, Alexei meant not only financial transfers, but some kind of social transfers. This is a question which is also of interest to us within the context of Ukrainian diaspora, that not only cities can receive not only money transfers, but some kind of expertise, some kind of vision as for development of the city or organization of processes in the city. So these are the things which are related to internal migration. Thank you so much, Alexandra. We have a question about the problem which arise during the construction work. However, I would like to ask the question which is related to data in the chat. So, Alexandra, maybe you can comment on that about the census. So, what kind of data census might give to us? And can you elaborate on that in the context of internal migration? Why is it necessary to have census data? Why alternative mechanisms are not enough? Well, as far as I understand, the data of mobile operators give us the data, more or less stable data, reliable data about the number of population. As for the quality characteristics, we can only get them from censuses. So the thing that we get from the census, so this is the language people use every day, and we still don't have a register at the level of administrative data with information about education level of our population. So this is the kind of information we can get from census only. And some of this data can be also obtained from alternative channels, for example, information about the employment, and it can be we can get this information through assessment of the workforce. Some of the information which we get from the census can be obtained from other sources of data. There are expert discussions that we need to switch to register-based censuses, and that we shall effectively use administrative data to carry out censuses. However, it requires more discussion as for the use of administrative and big data. And of course, we can discuss it for many hours. Thank you so much, Alexandra. So I would like to read you the question from Mykola Skiba. It seems to me that this is the question to um, Alexander. As for the commuters, in particular on the construction side, there is a question whether everything shall be decided at the administrative level, or probably it is more appropriate to use it through informal communication at the cultural and anthropological level. So thank you for the question. I'm not only an expert, I represent the trade union of construction workers. We work also through informal communication. So thank you for Mykola to say that not everything shall be decided at the administrative level. Yes, of course, in our industry, it is very important to use an official means of communication, because I told you that as for the strikes of construction workers, this is a reflection of what is happening. We work in the area of this informal communication, because if people start working as internal migrants, this is a very difficult step. As I told you, this is about hard work. This is about living and working far from the family. So, of course, it is obvious that this question is very important and very difficult. So we can use informal communications, but that is exactly what we do at the trade union. So thank you, Mykola, for raising this issue. That's exactly what we do. Oleg, I have a follow-up question to you about the mechanism of tackling different issues and about these issues themselves. You said that people who work on the construction site, so they often live there. Sometimes they live in temporary residences, or they live on the construction site in the makeshift buildings. So how the pandemic has impacted this situation, how these workers are resilient to crises like that. There was this first lockdown, which was quite strict. There were articles in the media that people who moved to Kyiv, for example, to work, they couldn't get back to their families. They didn't have any work. They didn't have a place to live. So how widespread those problems are. Yes, thank you so much for the question. It is very important for construction workers because they are the most mobile part of the working population, because they often move between different construction sites, and the pandemic just exacerbated this situation related to the health, safety, to security at construction sites. There were things when people just how to work to reach the construction site, because the employer was very strict and they wanted them to work. For example, we as the trade union helped people from Lviv region to help them with the transport, because the first year of the pandemic showed that local administration, they didn't even consider construction industry as something that shall continue working, because this is about infrastructure, infrastructure project. This is not about only about raising new buildings. It is also about maintaining current infrastructure. And we raised this issue this second year in 2021, after we got to know that there would be another lockdown in March. First and foremost, we raised the issue so the local administration pays enough attention to this. We control the issue of providing transport to the construction sites. However, there were some socially responsible employers who helped to provide transport to these people. Yes, I can definitely prove that those construction workers, they lived on the construction sites. The conditions were sometimes very difficult. However, they did their best to earn their money. We, as the trade union, we did our best to help those people get their payment, and we also help them provide some kind of daily activities. And sometimes there were no doors between the rooms of these people. So we controlled the provision of personal protection equipment, masks, and many other things. This is our mission. If employer doesn't want to do that, we will help them do that. Fortunately, the situation has changed for the better. However, it's not ideal. That is why we control the situation and provide those people with protective equipment. So I see a question from Diana. So let me ask, what is the percentage of internal migrants from construction sites? Maybe you have some kind of statistics. As for the total number, for example, those people who come to Kyiv and Oblast. As an example, construction site, 200 people work there. From 50 to 70 people, out of these 200, they are not locals, they are internal migrants. If you multiply it by the number of construction sites in Kyiv, you can see the number of construction workers who are commuters. I might say that these people are not only from Kyiv Oblast, but from other oblasts of Ukraine. As for the internal migration, I can say that generally from 30 to 40% of the total number of internal migrants, if we can calculate them, these are construction workers. Some of them do qualified work, some of them are jack of all trades. So you can calculate them. And this percentage corresponds to the official statistics of internal migrants. Thank you. We have one more question from Diana about data in the DIA app.
Таша, тебе не чути.
Перепрошую.
So I'm sorry, I occasionally muted myself. So question is the following. Will DIA app lead to improvement of collecting data? So is it efficient? And what about the privacy of this data? Thank you so much. This is the question related to big data, and I'm not an expert in that as for protection of personal data. So that's interesting, which data is collected by the data app. They collect only data from people who have this app. So people who are more technically advanced, who have more access to mobile phones, those people who need to download this app. So this app doesn't cover all the population, only some part of the population. And users of this app don't necessarily reflect all the population. So what is interesting about this app? Does DIA have the right to collect information about the population, and which information exactly? There were situations when during the lockdown, Ukrainians and foreigners who came to Ukraine, they had to upload the Vdoma Act at Home app during lockdown, and all the data were stored in the DIA app. Back then, there was a resolution by the government of Ukraine that this information shall only be used to track whether people are still on lockdown or not, are still in isolation or not. However, I do remember that several years ago, there was an estimation of the number of labor migrants from Ukraine who live in Poland. Back then, mobile operators, together with the employment agency, they presented this data. And it was interesting for the researchers and experts in this area to see on which stage the app allowed collecting data about relocation of people, about the languages they use, about the language of the mobile phones. And it was some kind of culture of using personal data when users provide consent to providing data. They don't always read the instructions, so they don't always know what kind of information will be collected. So how ethical it is, because not all app users understand that they provide access to this data. So there was a long discussion about the ethical side of this data collection, and it was difficult to understand when exactly this app got access to and got consent of the users to collect this data. So this is a question to regulation, which is quite complicated. But I think that big data has a huge potential, especially for calculating the number of migrants, and we shall consider this source of information. However, we need to develop mechanism of data protection, legal behavior tools. Thank you so much, Alexandra. So now I can see the chat. Katerina Babic writes that it seems to me it is very important that many people have downloaded this app in order to show their certificates of vaccination. So it's not only about those who are interested in digitalization. This is also about those who got vaccinated and want to have their certificate with them. I support what Alexandra has said. I can say that the app has been developed by a commercial company. So at first it was a commercial project, and then later through the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure, it was used, as Katerina has said, to upload COVID certificates. So the only thing I can say in relation to that, recently we had a conversation with the Ministry of Digitalization. We discussed statistical data. As an example, there is a journal where people who come to work get registered. There are cases when nobody is entered, but no one's name is filled in. So, and sometimes it seems like nobody works there. So I think that there shall be another way to fill in the data. And a lot of construction workers say, I don't want people to know that I work at a construction site. So there is this question that some people are legally employed, some of them are illegally employed. So this question of data is very important. This is a painful issue related to official or unofficial employment. Thank you. Thank you so much, Oleg. So as far as I see, there are no questions in the chat. So now let's proceed to conclusions to wrap up our conversation today. I would like to suggest our speakers to sum up today's discussion. Probably I will ask them to highlight some of the most important key issues, key challenges that we face right now. Challenges which we might have because internal migration is quite invisible in the public narrative. So data is not always collected. We don't know who these people are. So can you please tell us about the key challenges, about the key problems, and what might be the solutions, political responses to these issues? What shall be done first in order to tackle this issue to improve conditions of work of internal migrants? So that's it. Uh, so I don't know who will start first. If you are ready, please proceed.
Я можу почати.
Okay, I can start.
Власне, Україна сьогодні переживає досить
Ukraine is going through quite a dramatic series of changes in regional policy and in other policies as well. A lot of reforms will have long-term impact on people. Some of the reforms have just started, such as land reform. The most important that these reforms can change the system of population, and we need to develop new approaches to how to manage this system. What to do so people said that their rights provided by the Constitution are respected everywhere. On the other hand, there is this need to guarantee the right of those people to move to the place where they will feel more comfortable, where they will, the place where they can live and work normally. What we can do to improve the situation? In my opinion, the condition number one is to start collecting data to make this topic more visible in the society. I would like to say that there are two areas which don't receive enough attention in this discussion. The first one is this budgetary relationship. Alexandra has said before that those people, for example, who live in a different location, they can get access to a service, but they do not pay taxes there. So there is a question related that in the future, we might have a revision of the tax system in Ukraine.
I'm more than sure that sooner or later the local budget will stop being fulfilled exclusively from income tax, and there will be some property tax. If person has some real estate and will pay the tax for real estate, uh, um, they will pay the taxes and receive the services. Or if a person doesn't have any property, any real estate, then the landlord will pay. What else is a problem? Is an inadequate housing policy. There was a mass privatization in the beginning of the 90s, and it increased inequalities, not only in terms of the quality of the housing, but even the fact of its possession or the fact of not having um, uh, house or apartment. The renting market is rather high. Renting an apartment or a house is rather expensive, and it prevents people from moving somewhere. On the other hand, people live in the places and they own some apartments, but the price for this apartment is very low. At the same time, there are no perspectives for job in this city, but still people prefer to stay sometimes because they have their flat or house in this village or town, because if they migrate to bigger cities, they will have to pay more than half of their income for the rent. As of today, we know that hundreds, thousands of people are renting apartments and houses in other cities, and they're young migrants very often, mobile migrants, and we have to stop ignoring this subject. Thank you very much, Pavlo. A lot has been said about big data, about collection of data, and I would like to come back to the phenomenon of invisible migrants, the people who are not actually the city citizens, the people who are not registered in the city. They may live there for years, however, they have no possibility to get registered until they buy a flat or a house. And the local citizens, they have the attitude to them as to not real citizens as well. And it would be great if this invisible people, invisible citizens could become visible. And to make this happen, we need to provide some mechanisms to take into account those people who live in other cities, other from the place of their registration for a long time, to give them possibility to pay taxes into the budgets of the cities where they live, to create the mechanisms for those people, if they want this, to get registered in other cities. On the other hand, I think we have to speak about that there should be an understanding in place that all the city population should be interested to have real information on the number of citizens, because based on this data, local authorities take certain decisions. People should feel that these decisions could be professional and they could get better level of services if they inform the state about their real place of residence. And there should be an understanding that if we don't inform, it also influence the level of services that we receive, and not only us, but other citizens. It is complex thing, and there should be a complex approach. Yes, the state doesn't provide the mechanisms for the moment, but we have to understand that people are very often always unwilling to get registered and to provide information about them. And it is absolutely necessary for internal migrants to become the real citizens of the cities and to get all the relevant services. Yes, I would like to support Alexandra in her ideas. Yes, the state is not giving the mechanisms. I would like to give you an example of big cities, Lviv, Kyiv, Kharkiv. I think these cities would not be able to be very effective and successful without commuters, and employers know this. The biggest issue here is the rights of these labor migrants, their right to adequate payment, vacations, etc. And what I can say, why the state doesn't pay enough attention to this. For example, in Vinnytsia Oblast, people at certain enterprise, they work 3 hours, for example, because they have no more work. And they say, yes, we are looking for the possibility to work more because we work only 3 hours per day. We don't get enough payment and we want to commute somewhere. And in this town, there is only one enterprise. And if this enterprise is closed, there will be nothing at all. And the town will die. So we are losing the population, we are losing the enterprises, we are losing qualified professionals who start looking for different other ways to earn money. And there are a lot of other sectors, not only construction, but like domestic workers, housekeepers, etc. There are a lot of commuters among them as well. For example, women from Zhytomyr region, they come to Kyiv. They work for 2 weeks in the supermarket as cleaning ladies. They live there, and then for another 2 weeks, they go back to their little towns in Zhytomyr region. And as to the issue of rights, when people stay for a long time in the city, however, they're not enjoying their rights, it's a big problem because a person without rights, it's a very bad situation. And I can conclude that expert events as this one shows us that there are a lot of issues we have to pay attention to. And when we call any analytical, when we open any analytical report, there will be like 1.5 pages about 1.5 pages about internal migration and rest about labor migration, etc. And there is not enough attention to this question, but it's a very pressing problem because we know that like 5-6 cities in Ukraine that host thousands of people, like in Lviv, like there are about 100,000 people coming to work in Lviv from villages and towns, and we have to pay attention to this. That's why I'm very grateful for this event and to all the speakers. Thank you very much, Oleg. We have some comments. Katerina Babic comments on the situation about housing and work. Very often internally displaced people come back to non-government controlled areas because, however, they have a flat or house there, and it's a very painful issue. Also, the people shared some other problems like discrimination, hate speech when they migrate to new city. It's difficult for them to establish new contacts. all of these problems are very important, and I hope that due to our event and due to researches, this problem will become more and more visible. And now I would like to give the floor to coordinators of Ukraine Calling project, because this is the last event of this year dedicated to the local development. Stefan or Alena? Stephanie, maybe you would like to start?
I could start. Yeah, thank you very much to all the speakers, Alexandra, Pavlo, and Oleg, for these insights that were also a good reminder how much is there to do in the sense also of equality, different rights, starting from right to data protection or the right to the movement and to equal living conditions, and of course the security at the working place. So thank you very much for this really insightful, in very facets also explaining the different aspects that we are facing when it comes to internal migration and urban development. Thanks also for the questions from the audience. If you would like to get some more information on the project itself, it's the easiest way is to follow us on Facebook. I will put the link here directly in the chat. And yeah, thanks to all the organizers, to the interpreters, to without whom it would be impossible to do such an event too. And of course, yeah, also to the whole Cedos staff. Yeah, thank you very much, and we will be in contact.
Штефане, і тоді передаю слово ще Олені Сирбу.
Thank you everyone for this very deep and profound discussion. I also would like to thank for the moderation to Dasha for leading and facilitating this discussion, and also, of course, thanks for all the speakers. And I would like also to thank our organizing team as Anastasia Bobrova, Katerina Babic, and also the communication team who made this event possible, and also, of course, for the interpreters for your work. This was this was actually the last event for the public event for this year. I hope that our cooperation with Viadrina University and Ukraine Calling project will continue in the future, of course, and also we'll have a few other published materials which will be published during the next the nearest future. So you could also follow Cedos social media, where you can find everything related to Ukraine Calling project. Thank you, and give the word back to Tasha.
Дякую, Олено. Також ще раз дякую спікерам.
Thank you very much, Alena. I would like to thank once again to speakers, to our wonderful audience, and here we will say goodbye to each other, I guess. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.